Hollywood sold us a dream. Golden lights, flawless faces, eternal youth. But behind the velvet curtain, the dream came with a dosage. For decades, the brightest stars were quietly dimmed by addiction, hidden by studios that knew how to spin tragedy into glamour. These women weren't reckless. They were manufactured, medicated, and masked. And what you didn't see was carefully kept that way. This isn't just a story about old Hollywood. It's about the cost of being adored, and what it takes to disappear in plain sight. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed if you love unsettling stories that history tried to bury. It helps the channel more than you know. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it on your clock right now? Midnight? 3 a.m.? Let's see who else is up chasing ghosts. 1. Judy Garland. The first time Judy Garland stepped onto an MGM set, she was handed more than just a script. She was handed pills. Pep pills to wake up, downers to fall asleep, diet pills to keep her from becoming unmarketable. She was 16, and from that point forward, the line between performance and survival began to blur. She didn't so much play Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz as she floated through it, held up by the invisible machinery of amphetamines and the will of men in suits who saw her as an asset, not a teenager. Studio handlers monitored her meals, her rest, her weight. Fat was a word wielded like a weapon, and hunger became a luxury she couldn't afford. By the time audiences saw her radiate on screen, Garland was already running on artificial fumes, her mind tethered to a studio-manufactured rhythm of sleep and alertness. She smiled because she was told to. She danced because they made sure she could. What's chilling is not that she became addicted. It's that she was never really given a chance not to be. Her dependency wasn't a secret rebellion. It was a business model. The studio knew. The studio managed. The studio denied. Later in life, the cracks widened. The public glimpsed a version of Judy they weren't ready for. Vulnerable, erratic, human. But the seed had been planted decades earlier, behind a soundstage door marked talent, which could have just as easily read property. The real tragedy wasn't that Judy Garland broke down. It's that she was never built to last. And as the studio perfected this system, it didn't stop with Judy. It moved on to its next blonde commodity, one who would die more famous than she ever lived. 2. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was a persona. Norma Jean was the person, and in the space between the two, something got lost, and something else got medicated. By the time she became the most photographed woman on Earth, Monroe's vulnerability had become marketable, her instability carefully curated to make her seem both divine and reachable. What audiences didn't see was the daily chemical ballet behind the scenes. Barbiturates, amphetamines, sedatives, uppers to shoot a scene, downers to calm her nerves, pills to sleep, pills to wake, pills to smooth the unbearable edges of fame. In public, she was a breathy icon of desire. In private, she often struggled to get out of bed. The myth says she was fragile, but the truth is more grotesque. She was overmanaged, controlled, coddled by a rotating cast of doctors, handlers, studio reps, and supposed friends, all of whom enabled her pharmaceutical regimen in the name of helping her perform. They needed her functional just long enough to get through a close-up. She wasn't erratic because she was weak. She was erratic because she was chemically dismantled and then expected to pose like a goddess. And if she cried in her trailer, they called it artistic temperament. If she collapsed on set, they called in another prescription. Her final years were a quiet war between exhaustion and expectation. And when she slipped away from the world, people called it mysterious. But the mystery was never how she died. It was how many people made a living off her decline. Because Hollywood didn't just have a Marilyn problem. It had an addiction to its own illusions. And the next woman in line had a face just as beautiful and a bottle just as full. If you're still here after that, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was made for. So hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Late night? Early morning? Let's see who's keeping Hollywood's secrets company in the dark. 3. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor didn't just survive Hollywood. She conquered it. 8 marriages, 2 Oscars. Violet eyes that could hypnotize a camera. But behind the jewels, the headlines, and the perfectly arched brows, Taylor was often sedated. By grief, by pain, by pills. Her addiction didn't arrive with scandal. It arrived quietly, wrapped in prescription bottles labeled "Doctor Approved." It began, as many of these stories do, with pain. Physical first. Taylor suffered chronic illnesses, back injuries, surgeries. The studio had her insured, but the person underneath the policy still had to function. And so came the painkillers, the tranquilizers, the sleeping aids. She was prescribed not for escape, but for endurance. She wasn't reckless, she was exhausted. And the line between management and medication blurred fast. Being Elizabeth Taylor required a level of emotional performance that went far beyond the camera. She had to be radiant, scandalous, untouchable, lovable. She had to be mythic. And when life intruded, death, divorce, depression, the medicine cabinet became a kind of escape hatch. But Taylor was never just a victim of her own consumption. She eventually confronted her addiction head-on in a very un-Hollywood move. She told the truth, checked herself into rehab, publicly admitted the private fog she'd lived in for years. And while that gave her a redemption arc, it doesn't erase the years lost to the haze, or the question that haunts many. Why did it take nearly dying for the system to take her seriously? Because for actresses in Taylor's era, real pain was always inconvenient, unless it could be glamorized. Which brings us to someone whose addiction wasn't romanticized, but buried completely until it surfaced too late. 4. Alma Rubens. Alma Rubens was a ghost long before she died. In the silent film era, she was considered a rising star, a porcelain face with expressive eyes and a dramatic flair that drew audiences into frame after frame. But by the late 1920s, her name had faded from marquees and headlines, replaced instead with whispers, hospital records, and court appearances. What the public didn't know was that Rubens had been fighting an addiction to morphine and later heroin, at a time when neither was truly understood nor openly discussed. Back then, the solution wasn't treatment. It was silence. Studio executives managed the problem the way they managed all uncomfortable truths, with hush money, vague statements, and sudden vacations for their stars. If she showed up late or missed work, it was chalked up to exhaustion. If she collapsed, it was fatigue. All perfectly reasonable explanations for a lie. Rubens' addiction wasn't scandalous, it was inconvenient. And so, it was treated like a PR crisis, not a health emergency. But while studios could silence the press, they couldn't silence the downward spiral. By the time the truth started leaking out, through mugshots and rehab stints, it was too late. She was already being erased from the Hollywood narrative. Her final years were marked by institutionalization and public confusion. The woman who once lit up screens with raw emotional power became a cautionary tale no one wanted to tell. And yet, she wasn't the only silent era star swallowed by substances. Another actress, less remembered today, but equally tragic, found herself on the same path, with her descent just as carefully hidden. 5. Juanita Hansen. Juanita Hansen was supposed to be the next big thing. She had the looks, the charm, and the kind of screen presence that made silent film audiences lean in just a little closer. With her golden hair and daring persona, she became a serial queen, literally, starring in cliffhanger adventure reels that kept audiences hooked week after week. But behind the scenes, Juanita had her own series of cliffhangers, and none of them were scripted. Her descent began with an injury, followed by a prescription. A few studio-approved painkillers to get her back on set, and suddenly, the woman swinging from train cars was fighting something far more invisible. Morphine and cocaine weren't uncommon in the 1920s, and for actresses especially, prescriptions often came easier than sympathy. For Juanita, what started as a treatment quickly became a dependency, and what followed was a long, quiet disappearance from the spotlight. At the time, the studios didn't hold interventions. They held image campaigns. They denied everything, fed the press safe stories, and quietly shelved actresses who couldn't keep up with the performance. Juanita tried to recover. She even became an outspoken advocate for addiction awareness later in life, speaking publicly about her struggles. A radical move for a woman in an industry that preferred its stars silent in more ways than one. Still, the damage was done. Her name slipped out of Hollywood's collective memory, reduced to a cautionary whisper. Not because she failed, but because she became too real. And yet some actresses didn't even get that late-in-life reckoning. Some were consumed faster, discarded quicker. Like one woman who lived fast, burned bright, and left a trail of unanswered questions behind her. 6. Barbara Payton. Barbara Payton's life was a masterclass in Hollywood contradiction. She had the kind of raw magnetism that camera lenses loved. Icy blonde looks, a dangerous smile, and an off-screen life that played like noir fiction. She burst onto the scene in the late 1940s, seemingly made for the era's smoky thrillers. But almost as quickly as she rose, her world began to unravel. And no one, not the studios, not the agents, not the gossip columnists, wanted to admit why. Payton wasn't just troubled. She was chemically trapped. Her struggles with alcohol and heroin were whispered about in back rooms, deflected in interviews, and hidden beneath layers of manufactured scandal. The public saw the headlines, about affairs, about arrests, about money troubles, but they didn't see the prescriptions, or the addiction that turned every audition into a battlefield between clarity and chaos. Hollywood didn't save Barbara, it mined her. When she no longer sold tickets, the spotlight moved on. Her final years were marked by poverty and instability, a brutal contrast to the luxury she'd once been promised. She became a tabloid cautionary tale, the industry's favorite kind of tragic woman, beautiful, broken, and buried by the same system that once kissed her cheeks with stardust. And yet, even in the wreckage, her story wasn't singular. She belonged to a growing constellation of actresses whose addictions weren't the shameful secrets of bad decisions, but the predictable outcomes of a culture that treated dependency like a side effect of fame. The next starlet? She was marketed as Hollywood's platinum angel. But behind the bleached facade, something far darker brewed. 7. Jean Harlow. Jean Harlow was the original blonde bombshell, the blueprint for every peroxide icon that followed. With her platinum hair, baby face, and dangerous curves, she redefined screen sexuality in the 1930s. Audiences saw her as playful, provocative, untouchable. But what they didn't see, what they were never meant to see, was a woman carefully propped up by pills, secrecy, and a studio machine that didn't blink when its stars started to fray at the edges. MGM sold Harlow as spontaneous and effortless, but behind the curtain, the effort was brutal. The pressures of perfection were constant. Her weight, her energy, her moods. To manage it all, there were diet pills, sleep aids, and sedatives, a pharmacy hidden in a powder room. Her body was a canvas for image making, and that image had to be maintained at any cost. If she was exhausted, she was given a stimulant. If she was anxious, a downer. If she faltered, there was always another solution from the in-house doctor. Rumors swirled, but never reached the press. The studio's control over the media was airtight. Jean was always radiant, never unwell. Her death at just 26 was blamed on sudden illness. But some insiders whispered about stress, fatigue, over-medication, a body pushed too far, too fast. What makes Jean's story haunting isn't just her early exit, it's the eerie silence that followed. No exposé, no apology, just another star gone too soon, buried beneath a headline and forgotten prescriptions. And while Jean Harlow was the face of glamour, the next actress was the embodiment of complexity. A woman whose unraveling came not with glitter, but with shadows and storms. 8. Vivien Leigh. Vivien Leigh didn't just play Scarlett O'Hara, she became her. Fierce, captivating, impossible to ignore. But while audiences clung to her cinematic fire, what they didn't see was the flickering candle behind it. Leigh's battle wasn't loud. It was slow, disorienting, and hidden behind layers of British poise and professional obligation. Her struggles with mental illness are more widely acknowledged now, but what often gets edited out of the narrative is the role substances played in managing, or masking, those struggles. Sedatives, sleeping pills, alcohol. The quiet trio that turned sleepless nights into manageable mornings and public breakdowns into private ones. Her performances were electrifying, but they came at a cost. Between takes, she fought to stay centered. Off set, she fought to stay afloat. Studios didn't know how to deal with mental illness, but they did know how to keep a schedule. So they prescribed, they soothed, they shut it down. When she couldn't perform, excuses were printed. When she needed rest, a doctor was summoned. But no one stopped the machine. Not really. Not until it ran out of steam. Her marriage to Laurence Olivier was framed as tragic romance, but it was also collateral damage in a life slowly consumed by pressures she never chose. Vivien wasn't dramatic, she was drowning. But drama made better headlines. Even as her health declined, the industry kept calling. Because for all its talk of beauty and brilliance, Hollywood has a habit of calling back its ghosts, especially the ones still pretending to be alive. And the next ghost? She drank to forget, and the studio helped her remember only what they wanted her to. 9. Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth was a mirage, a name that sounded like satin and a face that could freeze a room mid-breath. She was the love goddess, a red-headed illusion crafted by Columbia Pictures from a shy dancer named Margarita Cancino. Her transformation was surgical, literal, and psychological. New hairline, new name, new life. But beneath the studio's precision makeover was a woman quietly slipping away, drink by drink. Rita's dependence on alcohol wasn't the wild tabloid circus that it became for other stars. It was something else, quieter, lonelier. The kind of drinking that follows a person home. The kind that helps you smile through a press junket or a dinner with strangers who think they know you. Columbia hit it well. The studio had perfected the art of denial, of rerouting rumors into flattering anecdotes. Rita wasn't troubled. She was just tired, overworked, misunderstood. She missed shoots not because she was sick, but because she was recharging. But the truth was harder to disguise in private. Marriages fell apart, projects stalled, friends grew distant. Her drinking wasn't just a symptom of stress. It was a response to being endlessly curated, praised, and misunderstood. Being worshipped sounds glamorous until you realize it means no one sees the real you. By the time she began showing signs of cognitive decline later in life, the narrative shifted again, this time into tragedy. But the real tragedy was how long she had been struggling in plain sight, while the world kept applauding. And if Rita was the goddess undone by silence, the next woman was chaos in a cocktail dress. Her addictions disguised as personality, her cries for help mistaken for punchlines. 10. Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead was a headline in human form. Southern-born, sharp-tongued, chain-smoking, and louder than any studio's PR department. She wasn't just an actress, she was an event. But behind the outrageous quips and high society antics was a dependency cocktail far more potent than her party persona let on. Alcohol, cocaine, sleeping pills. It was a revolving door of substances, masked under the label of eccentricity. For decades, Bankhead was allowed to spiral in full view because her destruction was entertaining. She'd slur a line on stage, and they'd call it unpredictable brilliance. She'd disappear from a set, and the press would chalk it up to her free spirit. Hollywood loves a spectacle, as long as it's photogenic. And Tallulah, with her wit and wreckage, gave them one. But addiction doesn't care about charisma. It erodes the charm, rewrites the punchlines, turns the life of the party into the cautionary tale. And despite the rumors and breakdowns, no one truly stepped in to stop it. Why would they? She was still bankable, still headline material, still larger than life. The truth is, Tallulah's wildness was often pain in a clever costume. She knew how to perform her chaos so well that few questioned what it was covering. And in a town where image was everything, she became the rare woman allowed to implode out loud, as long as she made it interesting. But not all actresses got that permission. Some had to suffer in silence, with smiles frozen on their faces. Like one comedian whose struggle was hidden under scripts and spotlights until the laughter couldn't drown it out anymore. 11. Judy Holliday. Judy Holliday had the kind of comedic timing that made even the smartest people feel clever. She could light up a screen with one blink and you missed it punchline. And her portrayal of the dumb blonde trope was so sharp, it bordered on subversive. But while her characters bumbled their way through chaos with charm, Holliday herself was balancing a far less scripted disaster, one that stayed mostly off camera, tucked behind the soft edges of a studio-controlled persona. Barbiturates and alcohol quietly became fixtures in her private life. Not in the spectacular, headline-grabbing way some actresses unraveled, but in the hushed, manageable sort of way that made it easier for everyone to pretend nothing was wrong. The industry loved her when she was funny, dependable, and marketable. But when the pace of performance wore thin, and her coping mechanisms turned chemical, the smiles stayed, only tighter. Unlike the party girls or the scandal magnates, Judy was packaged as safe, wholesome, even brainy in real life. So the idea of her struggling didn't compute. It wasn't just hidden. It was incompatible with the image they'd worked so hard to build. And so, the story of her addiction was largely relegated to footnotes, discovered only years later through personal accounts and biographies. The tragedy wasn't loud. It was slow, quiet, unspoken. And by the time she left the stage, most people never even knew there had been a struggle to hide. But addiction in Hollywood didn't always hide behind punchlines. Sometimes it was wrapped in satin, wrapped in vodka, and walking barefoot down the backlots of MGM, like the next woman who laughed loudly, drank quietly, and left behind more than just broken contracts. 12. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner was the definition of sultry defiance. She didn't just walk into a room, she disrupted it. With her gravelly voice, southern fire, and magnetic stare, she was impossible to ignore. But as much as her beauty was legendary, so was her drinking. What audiences never saw, though, was how carefully the studio hid just how deep the problem ran. MGM crafted Ava into a screen goddess, exotic, elusive, intoxicating. And when the cameras stopped rolling, that persona didn't clock out. The pressures of maintaining that mystique were relentless. And Ava, like so many others, turned to alcohol not as rebellion, but as relief. Not to enhance the performance, but to survive the hours between them. The industry tolerated her vices, up to a point. As long as she delivered on set, the rest could be explained away with the usual phrases. Temperamental, fiery, moody. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Ava was drinking because the persona they built for her didn't leave room for the person underneath. She admitted her struggles later in life, long after the limelight had cooled. But during her reign, the studio system protected the illusion at all costs. They didn't see addiction. They saw a liability. Or worse, a marketing problem. Still, Ava held on to her dignity, even as the bottle slowly stole more than it gave. But for another woman of the era, there was no slow descent, only a storm waiting to detonate. One whose name is still tangled in controversy, misdiagnosis, and the echo of things no studio press release could ever fix. 13. Frances Farmer. Frances Farmer didn't fit the mold, and Hollywood punished her for it. She was intelligent, outspoken, and deeply uninterested in playing the game. While other starlets smiled through studio contracts, Frances asked uncomfortable questions. She rejected the easy roles, criticized the industry, and refused to play docile. That alone made her dangerous. But what sealed her fate was when she began unraveling in a way no studio handler could spin. Her drinking began quietly. Not in public, not in parties, but in private. After long days of performing roles she loathed in films she didn't choose. Alcohol became the pause button in a life stuck on fast forward. But the more she drank, the more erratic she became. And the more erratic she became, the more the studio stepped back, letting her spiral while feeding the gossip mill from a safe distance. Farmer's fall was widely publicized, but the addiction behind it was rarely framed as anything more than bad behavior. Her mental health issues were front page. Her drinking problem was kept vague, implied, convenient. Because admitting a star was addicted meant admitting the system might be part of the problem, and no one wanted that headline. She was institutionalized, discredited, erased. Years later, she became a symbol of Hollywood cruelty, but by then, the damage was done. She was the cautionary tale they tried to forget, except her story wouldn't go quietly. And if Frances Farmer was the rebel the industry couldn't contain, the next woman was the sweetheart they tried to preserve. Until her image cracked under the weight of everything they refused to show. 14. Clara Bow. Clara Bow was the it girl of the Roaring Twenties, an electric storm in flapper fringe, with eyes that looked straight through the screen and into your bloodstream. She was raw, real, and completely unfiltered in an era that preferred its women polished and posed. But success didn't soften her edges. It only made them harder to carry. And when the cameras stopped rolling, Clara turned to something that didn't ask her to perform. Alcohol was her armor. Not glamorous, not chic, just necessary. It dulled the noise, quieted the judgment, softened the panic. Because behind the vivacious laugh and streetwise charm was someone constantly being dissected by a media machine that didn't understand her and a studio system that resented her lack of obedience. Bow was never trained to navigate the social labyrinth of Hollywood elites. She came from hardship, not finishing school. So when the pressure to conform became unbearable, she reached for something more predictable than fame, intoxication. Paramount worked hard to keep her image clean, but rumors leaked. Her breakdowns were spun as nervous exhaustion, her drinking disguised as overwork. The truth was simpler. Clara Bow was never built for the image they put her in, and when she broke down, they stepped over the pieces and moved on to the next ingenue. But Clara wasn't the only one left behind in the scramble for perfection. Another starlet, praised for her beauty and poise, hid her own unraveling behind lace, lipstick, and a bottle that never made it into the press photos. 15. Billy Dove. Billy Dove was often described as the most beautiful woman in Hollywood. It was meant as a compliment, of course, but it also became her prison. In the silent era, her face launched fantasies, her image sold innocence, and her name drew audiences into theaters like moths to a gilded flame. What wasn't visible behind the glow was the slow erosion taking place out of frame, an alcohol dependence she carried like a secret badge, hidden beneath chiffon gowns and studio-controlled smiles. Dove's addiction wasn't explosive or headline-grabbing. It was elegant, quiet, and carefully managed, until it wasn't. The pressure to stay perfect was unrelenting, and as the talkie revolution crept in, Billy felt her place begin to slip. Her voice, once irrelevant, now became a liability. The transition shook her confidence, and in a system that didn't offer therapy, support, or even honesty, she found solace in the only constant that didn't ask her to smile: a drink. The studios were expert illusionists. They dressed up dependency as exhaustion, edited out the trembling hands, and cropped the cracks from the photos. Billie stepped away from Hollywood while still adored, but the real reasons, emotional strain, addiction, disillusionment, were edited out of the script. Her exit wasn't scandalous, it was sanitized. And what lingered wasn't disgrace, but a carefully curated silence. But where Billie faded quietly, the next actress burned in plain view, her beauty unmatched, her drinking undeniable, and her downfall barely kept out of the papers by the thinnest studio veil imaginable. 16. Linda Darnell. Linda Darnell was only a teenager when Hollywood decided she was already a woman. With haunting eyes and a voice that could melt glass, she became one of 20th Century Fox's most bankable stars in the 1940s. But like so many of her peers, the rise came with a catch, a contract for her image, not her soul. And behind the scenes, Linda was quietly drowning in alcohol long before the public ever saw the waves. Her drinking didn't start as rebellion. It started as relief. Relief from the pressure to appear older, wiser, flawless. Relief from the men who controlled her roles and her time. Relief from being told what she was worth by people who only saw her face on a poster. She drank to calm the anxiety. She drank to sleep. Eventually, she drank to feel normal. Fox protected her until they didn't. Her once explosive career slowly cooled, and with fewer offers came more drinking. Friends grew concerned. Rumors swirled. But the truth stayed largely under wraps until after her tragic death, when biographies quietly stitched together what the press had politely ignored for years. Linda's decline wasn't treated as scandal. It was treated as inconvenient, a footnote to a flame that burned too bright for too long. And the next flame? It roared with defiance, wit, and fury, burning in every headline, hiding her pain beneath a technicolor persona Hollywood never bothered to understand. 17. Lupe Velez. Lupe Velez was fire in motion. Nicknamed the Mexican Spitfire, she had a laugh that could rattle ceilings and a screen presence so vibrant it practically rewrote the lighting. But behind the tempestuous persona and whirlwind success, Velez carried a private struggle that didn't fit the comedic packaging studios wrapped her in. Her alcohol use, long masked by her reputation for unpredictability, was both her coping mechanism and her undoing. Hollywood loved Lupe's energy, but only when it was convenient. When she drank too much, they called it passion. When she lashed out, it was temper. Her struggles with mental health were redirected into punchlines, and her drinking was filed under eccentricity, not concern. It was easier to turn her into a caricature than confront the pain she was trying to drown. For Velez, who straddled cultures in an industry that treated her like a novelty, alcohol offered something few others did: control, however fleeting. As the roles began to shrink and the spotlight cooled, the chaos grew louder. But the system didn't intervene. It capitalized, then looked away. She was remembered for her flair, her outbursts, her larger-than-life legacy. But few remember how carefully her struggles were repackaged as charm. And the next woman? She too made the world laugh, until the laughter became the thing that drowned her out, hiding addiction behind perfectly timed punchlines. 18. Thelma Todd. Thelma Todd was known as the Ice Cream Blonde, a moniker that sounds sweet until you realize it was designed to sell her like a product. She played the funny girl, the charming sidekick, the quick-witted blonde who could go toe-to-toe with comedy's biggest stars. But what the cameras missed was the woman behind the wit, exhausted, stretched thin, and drinking just to keep pace with the roles written for someone who wasn't allowed to feel anything but funny. Todd ran her own cafe, dined with the elite, and maintained a public image of success. But those close to her knew there was a different rhythm playing behind the scenes. Alcohol wasn't a scandal, it was a ritual. A nightly sedative for the pressure, a morning remedy for the night before. And though her issues with drinking weren't widely known to the public, the people around her had grown used to seeing her through a haze. As usual, the studio system avoided responsibility. If she stumbled, they said she was tired. If she missed a call time, they blamed overwork. There was no space for vulnerability, only silence in high heels. Thelma's mysterious death still sparks speculation, but the real mystery is how easily her addiction was buried beneath her comedic legacy. And the next buried story? It belonged to a woman with movie star looks and a script filled with tragedy, where the real heartbreak began only after the cameras stopped rolling. 19. Carol Landis. Carol Landis was the kind of star who lit up a room before she even spoke. Nicknamed the Ping Girl for reasons that sound more like marketing than respect, she had the look studios loved, glamorous, blonde, lively. But behind the upbeat interviews and bright publicity stills was a woman struggling to keep pace with an industry that praised her beauty while quietly bleeding her dry. Throughout the 1940s, Landis battled with severe depression and dependence on prescription drugs, mostly sleeping pills and tranquilizers, doled out by the same system that expected her to be perpetually charming and camera-ready. Her health suffered, her career wavered, and her personal life became increasingly unstable. But the studio line remained firm. Carol was just tired, just resting, just in between pictures. What they didn't say was that she was cracking under the pressure, medicated into compliance, and quietly pushed aside when she no longer fit the frame. Landis never got the legacy of a cautionary tale or the glamour of myth. Her addiction wasn't discussed, just redacted. Her name faded into footnotes, her story reduced to a tragic fade-out, one more star dimmed behind the curtain. And while Carol was erased quietly, the next actress was buried under the weight of physical pain, prescription dependency, and a system that couldn't imagine a woman who wasn't either cured or discarded. 20. Susan Peters. Susan Peters had what Hollywood considered a perfect trajectory. Young, beautiful, talented, and on the rise. Her performance in Random Harvest earned her an Academy Award nomination, and for a brief moment, she seemed destined to join the pantheon of greats. But that future was violently redirected after a hunting accident left her paralyzed from the waist down. What followed wasn't just a medical tragedy. It was a masterclass in Hollywood abandonment. In the years that followed, Peters became increasingly dependent on prescription painkillers. Not out of recklessness, but necessity. Physical pain was constant. Emotional pain was worse. The roles dried up, the phone stopped ringing, and the studio that had once praised her resilience quietly disappeared. The only consistency left was the medication that dulled what nothing else could. Her addiction was never made public, not while she was alive. Her image was curated with precision. Noble, tragic, inspirational. But the reality was much harder to market. She wasn't a symbol of triumph. She was a woman surviving one day at a time in a world that no longer had a place for her. And Hollywood, ever allergic to imperfection, let her drift into the background. Her story might have ended there, but the pattern didn't. Because the next actress, like Peters, was both a commodity and a caution, haunted by fame, hidden by handlers, and undone by the very system that made her shine. 21. Gail Russell. Gail Russell wasn't built for stardom. She admitted it herself. Shy, anxious, and painfully uncomfortable in the public eye, she never wanted to be an actress. She was pushed into it. Paramount saw her wide eyes and soft voice and decided she would be their next leading lady. They just forgot to ask if she could survive the spotlight. Her drinking began not out of defiance, but out of necessity, or so she was told. To ease nerves before screen tests, to calm her anxiety on set, to help her sleep after a day of pretending. It worked until it didn't. Alcohol became a crutch she couldn't set down, and the more she leaned on it, the more the studio insisted she get it under control. Not for her health, of course, for the sake of production schedules. Russell's alcoholism was known within the industry but spun into something softer in the press. Emotional strain, exhaustion, health setbacks. No one used the word addiction. That was too real, too messy. Paramount managed the narrative, even as Russell's performances became more erratic and her health visibly declined. She spent her final years in isolation, her career long behind her, her legacy barely acknowledged, not failed, forgotten. And if Gail Russell's pain was hidden in hushed tones and behind-the-scenes fixes, the next actress was a walking headline, gorgeous, gifted, and slowly unraveling beneath a mask of poise and perfectly prescribed medication. 22. Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge was a pioneer, a star, and a symbol, whether she wanted to be or not. As the first black woman nominated for a Best Actress Oscar, she carried the weight of 1,000 expectations. She had to be perfect, poised, grateful, palatable, and behind all of it, she had to stay silent about the strain. Dandridge's use of prescribed medications and alcohol was never the headline. It was background noise. Quietly sanctioned by doctors, quietly ignored by studios. The pressure she was under wasn't just professional, it was historic. She was walking a tightrope built by racism and reinforced by a system that exploited her beauty but had no idea how to protect her. Painkillers, sedatives, sleeping aids, they were part of her routine, part of the armor. The studio didn't intervene. They did what they always did, kept her working, kept her smiling, and kept her struggles off the record. When her career slowed, so did the attention. And as the roles dried up, so did the studio's concern. By the time her addiction became visible, the industry had already moved on, leaving behind only the iconography. Dorothy was allowed to shine, but never allowed to stumble. And that blueprint, beauty, pressure, silence, was passed on again. The next woman in line, she wore elegance like a costume and hid her dependency behind scripts, secrets, and a signature smile. 23. Jean Tierney. Jean Tierney's beauty was the kind that didn't need to try. She was poised, polished, and camera-ready from every angle. But the grace that defined her screen presence was hard-won, held together by a fragile balance of mental health struggles and prescribed medication that no one dared to speak about in public. Hollywood preferred its leading ladies glamorous, not human. Tierney's battles with depression and anxiety were well documented, eventually. But during the height of her fame, they were cloaked in coded language, exhaustion, rest cures, and private retreats. In truth, Tierney was deeply unwell at times, and her dependency on sedatives and barbiturates became a part of her off-screen survival kit. The pills helped her sleep, helped her focus, helped her pretend she was fine. She wasn't. But the industry didn't ask questions. She continued to work, even as her emotional and physical health declined. As long as she showed up on time and hit her marks, no one interfered. That was the rule. Perform now, fall apart later. Years later, she spoke candidly about her mental health. By then, the damage was already done. She was one of the few to live long enough to reflect. But her story echoed a pattern far too familiar. And the actress who followed in her footsteps? She wore pearls, won Oscars, and drank her way through a tightly choreographed version of perfection that the studio never dared to interrupt. 24. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford didn't just act, she conquered. Her career spanned decades, her ambition unmatched, her control over her image legendary. But behind the steel gaze and sharply drawn eyebrows was a woman who relied heavily on alcohol and prescription medications to maintain the mask of invincibility. Crawford's dependency was an open secret in certain circles, but carefully downplayed in the press. She was too valuable to tarnish. MGM didn't invest in stars. They manufactured icons. And icons don't have breakdowns. They have difficult days. Her need for control extended to every corner of her life. Wardrobe, lighting, co-stars, publicity. And when life didn't obey her choreography, Alcohol filled in the gaps. Sleeping pills came next. The more pressure she felt to remain flawless, the more chemically fortified that perfection became. Her public image, reinforced by a barrage of carefully staged interviews and pristine photo shoots, rarely cracked. But those closest to her, assistants, directors, even her own children, witnessed the unraveling in real time. Still, the studio stood by her, not because they cared, but because she remained profitable. Joan Crawford endured by transforming her pain into discipline. But beneath that discipline was dependency, a silent partner in her success. She wouldn't be the last, because the final woman on this list wasn't as ruthless or as guarded. She broke, quietly and completely, within the same system that once promised her everything. 25. Betty Hutton. Betty Hutton was a human firecracker, bouncing, belting, and blasting her way through musicals with enough energy to light up 3 sound stages. Audiences adored her for it. Studios relied on it. But what no one wanted to acknowledge was that behind the hyperactive charm was a woman running on nerves, fear, and eventually prescription pills. Hutton's addiction didn't start with rebellion. It started in the most ordinary Hollywood-approved way. Sleeping pills, handed over by studio doctors to help her cope. Cope with exhaustion, cope with pressure, cope with being everyone's favorite burst of sunshine, even when she was falling apart. Over time, the medications became less about rest and more about survival. Her career had a steep climb, but an even steeper drop. As musical tastes changed and roles dried up, so did the patience of an industry that once couldn't get enough of her. Her addiction worsened in the shadows. Paramount, once so eager to capitalize on her energy, had little to say when that energy turned shaky and unpredictable. Later in life, Hutton spoke openly about her struggles, admitting that the addiction began when she was still the studio's golden girl. But by then, the system that enabled it had already erased her from its memory. And so, she became the final name on a long, devastating list, an exclamation mark at the end of a sentence Hollywood never wanted to write. But if Betty was the last one on our list, she certainly wasn't the last, because the machinery that consumed them, it's still running, just under better lighting.